Hi investigators and security risk analysts. I'm Mike Evans from the Australian Security Academy, and in this presentation I am going to cover establishing the risk context. Now, this presentation is part of the Australian Security Academy's commitment to 24 hours of online face-to-face training for its students, but this presentation covers aspects of 7 other nationally recognised qualifications and at least 14 other nationally recognised units. So it will be used extensively in other areas. So we're establishing the risk context today. That's it. We will not be stepping outside of the context. So we're going to be looking at the strategic context, the organisational context, the scope, aims and terms of reference, and the risk criteria. There's no such thing as a basic security risk analysis presentation. They're all very similar, and the more complicated they are, the less you want to watch them. So this is about the basics of the context in security risk management, something that you can use at the coalface of any government or corporate investigation where you work. So let's have a look at the strategic context. The strategic context defines the relationship to external agencies or business. So you might be a cement making firm, you might be the tax office, you could be the pet shop. It doesn't matter, but in the strategic context, you're looking at the big picture of your external relationships. You must define those relationships. For example, if you're a tax office for a state government department, you'll have them with interstate government departments and territories. You must know what your client and stakeholder expectations are. What are we in the business to do? Well, if we're the tax office, we're in the business of taxing every last cent out of Mike Evans, the person presenting today. That's what they are there to do. What is their government charter? It's written, it's documented, and they have a government charter. A corporation will have a government charter. In what environment are we or do we operate? What are the cultural, commercial, social, legal, strategic issues around the environment in which we operate in? What is our strategic plan? Now, this presentation is being done in early September, the 20th of December, sorry, not September, 2021. And it's a time where there is issues with COVID-19 and its variants. And these are security risk management issues that are really topical at the time. So a government department, for example, in health, is looking at some very big social, legal, strategic and commercial and cultural issues in relation to their context of their security risk management. What is the organisational context? Well, they have documented missions and goals. Ice cream factories have documented missions and goals. So do government departments. So do you, the private investigator going into your own private investigation business, the manager operating fraud control within a government department. You have access to those missions and goals. What's the structure of the organisation? What is critical to your operations? Why do you exist? This is the context in which you'll be operating. What are the capabilities? Now, I was informed last week we had one young student who graduated from a government program a couple of years ago. G'day, Michelle, how are you going? Great to see you. We had a young lady graduate from a government department a couple of years ago. And she went on to work for one of the largest security firms in Australia. It turns over $150 million a year, that firm. Very capable young lady. So she's got an organisation where she's capable as the contracts manager, and she can run the capabilities of that organisation. I think she could run the capabilities of an organisation 10 times that size, but we must know what they are. Any projects in the relationship to the agency. The areas of impact to outputs and functions, so the asset and resource base of the organisation. What context is that, including personnel and resource providers? So the people that are supplying you trained, competent staff, the people that are supplying you what you need to function, whether that's computers, furniture, office space, trucks, legal advice, whatever it may be. Revenue and entitlements and budgets to manage it. This is what's at risk in your context. Cost of activities, both direct and indirect. People, staff, clients' safety. Absolutely paramount in the COVID-19 pandemic situation where I am presenting this presentation today. Community, environment, ethnic, social, ecological, etc. Intangibles such as reputation and goodwill. Now, if you're a government department, you may not have a lot of goodwill, but if you're a corporation, that could be very important. And your organisation's behaviour. What is the context of that? These are the things you must know. What damage could occur to your organisation? Now, if it's a government department, federal or even state, it could be harm to national security and national interests. Government departments get infiltrated by individuals who are there just to disseminate information to outlaw motorcycle gangs, to other governments, to people that will pay for it. So think of the damage that could occur in the context of the risk of the organisation you're conducting the establishment of the risk context for. What harm could happen to the national economy? What's the effect on the organisation's ability to function? What may be the loss of vital or valuable resources, physical or mental harm to people, administrative and or political embarrassment? Now, political embarrassment, an example of that was when the pandemic first started, and in Melbourne they awarded a $30 million contract to a New South Wales security firm to fulfil that contract, and it did not end well. And there's money still owed on that contract. The matter's gone to court. It was rushed. It was done in a hurry. There was no accountability assigned to anybody. And big damage occurred to the reputation of the state of Victoria's department in charge. What additional damage? You're going to spend taxpayers' money unwisely, attract attention of the Privacy Commissioner. There could be expensive litigation. The organisation could even be disbanded. The organisation's budget may be cut back. A marketplace lost and other lost opportunities. The minister, the CEO embarrassed. Now, an example of marketplace loss are the Australian government asked to have an international review of where COVID-19 first started. And the Chinese government decided that they didn't like that. So they upped the price of imported goods from Australia into China in wheat and wine and other commodities, except for coal, which they need. And that caused loss of market to Australian producers for a while. Now, it wasn't the end of the world. They were able to replace that. They risk managed for that sort of thing at that level. What's the impact on you from your surrounding environment? So here we go again. In the pandemic times, we're seeing in Melbourne through 2021 and the last couple of months of it, unwanted blockades, demonstrations and congregations of people protesting about mask and vaccine mandates. If it's handled well, you don't have that issue. it hasn't been handled well. So in the context of that, if you have a business operating in Victoria, it's very difficult. In New South Wales, it may be great because you haven't got those issues with people protesting. There may be unwanted pollution or noise, false alarms, bomb threats or robbery or forced entry, maybe contextual issues, staff harassment, physical and verbal. Now, in the pandemic times, and I keep referring to that because it's topical, you'll watch this in 5 years and go, oh, well, that was over in 2 years. What's the big deal? Well, you might have another one later on, but this is just an example. So staff have to ask people for their vaccination records or they can't come in, and they will have been physically and verbally harassed. There might be deliberate damage or natural disasters. There may be loss of clients. So these, again, are all contextual issues for you, the security risk manager. Now, the scale doesn't matter. I'm talking about state government. I'm talking about federal government. All this applies to the little tiny single person private investigator business or the single person security risk analysis to a consultant out of New South Wales who is doing security risk assessments for the local primary school, footy club, and for the local New Year's Eve celebrations. This is contextually applies to everything exactly the same. Scale doesn't matter. What acts, legislation, standards, policies, guidelines are accepted practice. So what acts, legislation, guidelines affect the methodology, e.g. the Public Service Act, the Criminal Code Act? Does the organisation have a particular risk standard policies which are adhered to? So there's suggested ones there. Are there accepted practices which are to be followed? Now, again, I'll go back to the pandemic times. There'll be social distancing. There'll be options for meetings online rather than face-to-face. There'll be no handshakes at any meetings. There may be an elbow bump or whatever. So these things are fluid in the context of the time. So let's have a look at the risk management context, establishing the scope of the review. So you must define the project and establish its goals and objectives. You must define the extent of the project, maybe a dollar value, maybe an ongoing time frame with reviews. You must identify the resources required to complete the project, including dollars, physical, human, and information resources. For example, review the whole of the activity or just a part. Review only high-risk aspects. Review in response to a specific request. Review only one particular risk or threat. Review after a specific incident. Now, 4 days before this presentation in Devonport in Tasmania, at a grade 6 end of year school celebration, to date, 6 children have lost their lives due to a disaster at that end of year celebration where a jumping castle in which they were having fun and jumping was lifted off the ground. They say 10 metres high. I don't know how they know that. And as a result, to this point in time, 6 students lost their lives. Now, there are more that are critically injured, and that is just an awful, tragic situation that could have been prevented with a contextual security risk management or risk management prevention, making sure this thing was tied down, making sure this thing wasn't used in a windy situation. It's all right in 100% hindsight, but in Tasmania, other people have been killed on jumping castles at the Brighton show and in other places, and that's historically still in living memory. And that kind of risk is a specific incident risk that could happen at a school that should be in a risk management plan, just as an example. And it's tragic, absolutely tragic. The other risk from that, while we're here in establishing the context, is all the emergency services people that saw deceased children in situ, injured children, upset adults, total chaos, nothing they could do to save those lives of those that were deceased. So they will have post-traumatic stress disorder, psychological injuries, that sort of thing. So this has had a multiplicity of effect because the scope of the review has been put in a drawer in a government department somewhere in Tasmania 5 years ago and forgotten about. Issues to identify, expectations of various stakeholders. So what do management want? What do the customers want? What do the suppliers want? Again, an example in pandemic times. Everybody wants everything today, but there is a global limitation on what can be delivered. So expectations will vary in a fluid document. Aspects vital to operation of the organisation. What's totally vital to this organisation's operation? What are the key operational elements and what are the major projects that they do? The scope, aim in terms of reference, the scope, the extent and coverage of the review for this context, the aims, desired, legal, achievable, clear outcomes or objectives when the risk review is meant to achieve, and the terms of reference, the agreed parameters within which the review will be conducted, including those issues or methods which are not to be investigated or used. The aims are to undertake a risk review, for example, the Federal Court of Australia. We'll have action and management plans, and they are to be produced at the end of the review. Devise monitoring and follow-up strategies. Now, that's a pretty big review if you go and do that. It's not just based in Canberra, it's going to affect nationwide. So the aim to undertake a risk review for the Federal Court of Australia and from that review to formulate action and management plans, the terms of reference is to include all federal courts throughout Australia: Hobart, Perth, Sydney, Adelaide, Darwin, Melbourne, Brisbane. All employees, consultants and contractors may be interviewed. Now that's a pretty big ask. Every one of them is going to have contractors in the form of plumbers and electricians and technicians that keep those places operating, as well as employees such as magistrates. They might have internal legal advisors. They'll have tipstaves that work at the court. So it's a big review. All reviews are to be completed by the 1st of July 2022. A written report is to be compiled for each location. All travel accommodation related expenditure is to be approved prior to travel, and all reports will be classified according to their sensitivity. Now, they're very sensitive because outlaw motorcycle gangs, drug dealers could end up in the Federal Court of Australia. And you just don't know. Bomb threats, arson threats, infiltration by people employed by them could happen. So let's have a look at the risk evaluation criteria in our context establishment. With the risk evaluation criteria in context establishment, we're going to clarify what senior management regard as the risk criteria to be used. What is a tolerable level of risk? Aspects or activities that are vital, major and significant to the outputs, functions that is being reviewed. You must know that. Okay, that has to be documented and that has to exist. Now, in a presentation last week, and I was talking about the Devonport tragedy, for example, I spoke about the Transport Accident Commission of Victoria. Now, they have a risk management plan. They have a plan for a totally big disaster that would affect them. For example, it could be a fully laden rush hour train that goes off the rails and there's multiple fatalities and multiple injuries. Now, they have a plan for that. Now, there's no tolerable level of risk, but it's for multiple fatalities. And they know what activities, vital, major and significant to the outputs and functions when that is reviewed, are important. They document that, they watch it. They don't just let it sit and gather dust in a drawer. The risk criteria set by management. This criteria will help you in the context, which is what we're talking about today, identify the more important risks. You'll prepare appropriate treatments and countermeasures later on, and we'll talk about that in another presentation. You'll provide a benchmark against which the success of the action plan can be measured. Now, that benchmark could be how quickly the telephones are answered in time or something like that, how quickly a response is given to a minister by a government department manager. Here's some risk criteria in an example. An extreme risk. Immediate action will be required. Executive attention required. Further research recommended on analysis or vulnerability. Now, that's your COVID-19 response federally. Stay at home, we'll pay you, with JobKeeper, don't spread it. That was an extreme risk. A high risk, action required, senior management attention required, further research may be required on analysis or vulnerability. Now, high risk situations happen every day. They are dealt with, right? On the whole, mostly successfully. There are moderate risks, some action required, management responsibility must be specified, and low risk, action may not be required, management be routine procedures. Risk criteria, when we're establishing the context, takes into consideration functions, programs, capabilities, and assets which are considered vital, expectations of stakeholders, integrity and availability of resources, continuity of functions and outputs, industry codes and mission statements. An example of integrity and availability of resources in the early days of the pandemic of 2020, some people decided that they were going to sell face masks to the government. And the government bought these face masks, and they were cheap Chinese masks that didn't work and didn't prevent transmission of COVID-19 via personal contact. So that's an integrity and availability of a resource in a time of high need. The criticality rating. The criticality rating of an asset or function is determined from an analysis of the consequences of its loss, compromise, destruction, etc. Criticality ratings include vital. Loss or compromise will result in the abandonment of long-term cessation of agency and some of its functions. A really extreme example of that would be if we lost the tax office through computer hacking or something like that, and it went down for 6 months. That would have serious long-term consequences to the income of our government. Loss or compromise at major, level 2, will necessitate a major change in organisation practices and activities and will have a major impact on the organisation's practices, activities and financial position. Significant loss or compromise will have a significant effect on the organisation's practices, activities and financial position. And low, loss or compromise will be covered by usual practices, unknown, insufficient data is available for evaluation. So what do you do now? Read over your supplied information on your organisation. Remember, the context situation can be applied on scale to someone doing a security risk assessment for the local footy team's grand final, just as much as they can for a security risk assessment for an atomic energy plant, nuclear power plant. The process is the same. We're establishing the context. Determine what information needs expansion, clarification or explanation, and decide on what questions you need to ask management to gain this information. Oops. I've been fortunate enough throughout my corporate career to see the security risk management plans of some substantial and significant organisations, including the Sydney Olympic Games, the Beijing Olympic Games, the Spanish Olympic Games, the London Olympic Games, the Commonwealth Games in between all of those, and several of the courts around Australia, and several major transport organisations for public transport. The one thing that I know in the context establishment of their security risk assessment is those large organisations do not have a 400-page document with all that information in it. They basically have a 1 to 2 page glance at it so they can use that document to work from there and make it real in relation to the context. I'll be back tomorrow with part 2 of the presentation for compliance with the Victorian Police Licensing Regulation Division CPP 30619 Certificate 3 in Investigative Services, and the other units and qualifications that I referred to earlier in relation to this presentation. Thanks for watching. I'm Mike Evans from the Australian Security Academy. Hey, do me a favour, Google Spy Curious. Thanks for that. See you soon.